So welcome everyone to today's event. We're really excited that we have Marta Pardavi here today with us. Welcome. So welcome to our guests and welcome to the audience. So first of all, just want to put a disclaimer. So this event will be recorded so that everyone that couldn't join will be able to watch it later. So this event today is organized by the European Debate Initiative. We are an organization that we arrange events a few times a month about different European issues with people that we find interesting and fascinating and have a lot of knowledge within their fields. So that's everything from politicians, or in this case, human rights defenders, or members of the European Parliament, and so on. If you're interested in following more of our events, do follow us on our social media. But let's get started with today's debate. So we are really honored to have you, Marta Pardavi, with us today. And if you have any questions during this event, please write them in the chat and then let us know if you want to so say them out loud, then we can give you the floor, or if you'd rather that we ask them for you, that's also completely fine. And you can ask questions during the event or in the last half hour, where we will have an open floor discussion. But let's start with an introduction of our guest speaker.
Yes, welcome, a warm welcome to Marta Pardavi. It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for taking your time. I'll quickly introduce you to the audience. So Marta Pardavi is a human rights lawyer who studied law in Budapest, and now she's the co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, so a well-known human rights organization in Budapest. And over the last few years, she has defended civil and political rights in her country, worked in the field of refugee protection, and confronted those who try to dismantle civil society or normalize xenophobia and hate crimes. And this was not without risk. So in return, she has been also attacked in the media, close to the government, and subjected to hate campaigns. And previously, she worked as vice chair of the European Council on Refugees and Exile between 2003 and 2011. And she's currently in Florence doing a fellowship at the European University Institute. And in 2019, she was awarded the Civil Rights Defender of the Year award for her dedication and exceptional contribution to resist inhumane treatment of the most vulnerable. And so, I mean, welcome. It's great to have you here. And we'll start the debate maybe with a more open question. How did you get involved in the field of human rights, and what were your main motivations at the beginning?
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming, and also thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be with you here, and I see a lot of people are joining, and I do see one or two people I know, and I will not call them out, but I am saying hi. Where did I start with my human rights career? Some people, I think, are extremely focused from an early age on what they want to do. But I have to disappoint you, that was not necessarily the case. I did want to go to law school, and I did go to law school right away after finishing high school in Hungary. But this was in the early 90s. I don't want to even ask some of you if this was a time when you were, in an earlier phase of your development, or but it was a time certainly which was extremely interesting in Hungary from a political perspective. There was, it was the political changes, the whole transformation that the country was going on was full blown. And at the same time, the legal education had not caught up with that pace of change yet. It was at times extremely boring, I must say. Some of the subjects escaped me, some were really interesting. So it was a mix. And in my third year of law school, I was quite confused about what am I doing in this place? some of the subjects made law seem like an utterly boring topic. And so I started mostly by almost coincidence at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, which was an organization that had already been set up in Hungary in 1989. And it was part of a very large European or even one could say global movement, civil society movement to hold governments accountable to various human rights obligations that they had signed up to. But in Hungary, the organization was still very small, and it was only in the late 94 that an office with a few members of the team had been set up. And so when I joined first, it was a tiny team, and all of a sudden, and it's very often, I think, as it happens when you're working in a very small team, you end up doing everything, which is both confusing, but it's also a great learning opportunity. It's a pretty sharp learning curve too. And together with my colleagues who were led by a very important and very, I think, courageous man called Ferenc Kőszeg, a former political dissident in Hungary and then a member of parliament, we went to an immigration detention facility, which was basically the only type of such a detention center at the time in Hungary. And it was the first time that civilians, not officials, but basically lay people, outsiders, could have access to a detention facility where migrants were held. And we did a fact-finding mission. And all of a sudden, from the pretty abstract and sometimes quite incomprehensible field in law school about civil procedure without ever having seen a courtroom, I was, together with a few of my law school friends, thrust into a place which was reality. And where you could see that knowing what the law means and what rights one has can put anyone at a great advantage, and not knowing can put you at an extremely exploitable, vulnerable situation. This was a detention center where the legal rules on immigration, on expulsion, on deportation, on human rights safeguards in Hungary at the time were not very sophisticated, and many of them were still basically very much influenced by the communist era, where all foreigners were basically seen as, well, suspicious, to say the least. And where the only approach to migration was a law enforcement and security angle. And so there was a lot of people held for various reasons. Some had never had a visa, some had overstayed their visa, some were, as we found out, should have been genuine asylum seekers, but no one has ever told them that there was an opportunity. They had no idea, no lawyers, no information, hardly ever any proper translation. And also the conditions of their detention were very dire. And so, within a span of a couple of weeks, I saw what lawyers can do. And what the organization with its team of lawyers and doctors and also sociologists did was to produce a report on this detention center, from looking at all aspects of the legal, of the physical conditions, of the information that people had. And after this report was published, the then Minister of Interior decided to shut this camp down. And there were, over time, a lot of legal changes that were partly triggered and brought about by this whole, idea that that human rights safeguards should be put in place in a detention center, particularly when it comes to immigration. And so this was the first exposure. And then I continued to work at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee all through my law school years and later too. The organization, and we can talk about this, evolved, the context evolved, everything changed over time, except maybe the name of the organization and the main sort of core ideas. that we work on. But this was how I got started. And I think this was a very important experience, partly because I learned that law is really important. It's a tool for people to be safe. And at the same time, legal rules can be extremely abusive and can put people literally in danger if they're not applied well, if they deviate from what in Europe I think would call proper, civilized, human rights, rule of law compliant principles.
So now we know a bit about the background for how you got involved with the Helsinki Committee. So then what are you working on now, like personal projects or topics that you're working on? Because the committee is working on obviously a broad range of topics. For example, helping victims of human rights abuses with, for example, legal assistance, and especially with asylum seekers, you're also very active. The conditions of detainment, as you also mentioned. So what are the main issues that you're working on right now within your involvement of the Helsinki Committee?
Well, over time, as I said, the organization grew, but some of the topics that we found extremely important still are part of our core mandate. So maybe I could just give you a short overview of the kinds of things that the Helsinki Committee is working on today in 2021. This is very broad, in fact, but there are four main themes. And these have changed over time, particularly in the last 10 years. For a very long time, we were, I think, best known for our expertise on refugee protection issues, particularly the legal issues. On asylum and on the detention of migrants, on how certain groups of migrants and asylum seekers should be treated under law, and calling for better protection. Also building capacity, so training in Hungary and also abroad globally on refugee protection principles. And the other thing that the Helsinki Committee was for a very long time, I think, well known for was its work on monitoring detention conditions in prisons and police jails. In the mid to late 90s, many Central European human rights organizations and many Helsinki committees among them were able to gain access to detention centers. And so human rights organizations, staff and lawyers and doctors working with them could go into police jails, prisons, and immigration and asylum reception or detention centers. This was a major positive development, something that many human rights organizations to the west of Hungary had looked at with envy even, because it was not something that was accorded to them. But it was extremely important at a time where the idea that if civilians can have access to detention centers that can help prevent ill treatment and torture was very crucial. And we saw how that worked in practice. And then over time, we've broadened these two themes into a broader criminal justice profile. So we started looking at not only conditions of detention, but also how to ensure that people who are poor won't be at a disadvantage when they are facing a criminal procedure, or when people who are belonging to, in Hungary, the Roma minority won't be at a disadvantage when they come into contact with law enforcement. So ethnic profiling. I know many of you are probably from the Netherlands, but not all of you, I think. But this is an issue, of course, that is ethnic profiling that is extremely topical everywhere. In Hungary, this comes up particularly with Roma people. And then through looking at access to justice, through looking at ethnic profiling, we also started to look more broadly at the legal framework that should be in place to ensure that equal treatment is protected, that it's protected effectively in reality. And also after 2010, when a lot of major constitutional changes happen in Hungary all of a sudden, and that have effectively led to a very significant weakening of the balance of power, the checks and balances and other constitutional protections. We started, of course, focusing on these broader issues. I think for a very long time, many human rights organizations in Hungary, maybe elsewhere too, also in what we considered developed democracies, thought that it would be important to focus on specific issues, but not necessarily on democracy itself, because that's something that's granted. And I think Hungary's example sadly goes to show that you cannot take that for granted, and it can be, under certain circumstances, weakened very rapidly and very significantly. And so we started looking at, as these constitutional changes were happening in Hungary, on the basic infrastructure, what can keep government in check. Looking at the judiciary, looking at also civil society as it became under pretty focused attacks in 2014. Shrinking civil society space is also not typical only in Hungary. We see this in other European Union member states even. Of course, if we look broader, then we see a lot of examples of very worrying trends. So over time, we started looking at what is the, beyond specific human rights issues, what is the infrastructure that is the landscape that is meant to uphold them, where everybody can enjoy every single human right of theirs. And so right now, what I'm focused mostly on within the organization, which, as I said, has grown, and so now it's 35 people. I can't say they're all sitting in one space because of COVID rules, but normally we do have an office in Budapest where everybody can meet up, and it's quite a number of people, and it's a very busy office normally. So right now, what I'm doing is, together with my fellow co-chair, we lead the organization, and what I'm focused on mostly in the past couple of years is the international advocacy work. Focusing on civil society space and also rule of law. And we can talk about what this means. This year, though, I'm on a sabbatical, so I am in Florence, and I'm working on a project that is meant to promote and support human rights defender organizations, NGOs, in many European Union member states to work together more closely on transnationally, so across the borders, and also towards European institutions to call for better protection of civic space and rule of law. This is a project that I've been very enthusiastic about for a long time, as over time we, together with colleagues, have started taking part in increasing with spending more and more time also, and attention and effort on looking at what is the European Union doing, what kind of policies are there at the EU level to prevent, slow down, remedy the democratic backsliding that is happening in Hungary and Poland. And the more I went together with, for example, Polish and Romanian colleagues to Brussels, the more I saw that there would be a need to bring more organizations, people, individuals from member states themselves to these Brussels-based discussions, and also to be more aware of what's going on elsewhere, so that we don't only focus on our own national settings, but rather also keep an eye out and know how other member states situations can and will impact on what we live in. And so the project that I'm working on now is bringing these NGOs together, and we've selected, together with the Netherlands Helsinki Committee and also the Hertie School in Berlin, an excellent group of 27 people from 25 human rights organizations, and we're working together to build more solidarity, in fact. So that's what I'm doing here in Florence, and also gives me more time to focus on learning and reading, something that in my day-to-day work in the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, along with my colleagues, we don't have much time to do, or not enough time to do that.
Wow, so that's a lot of well, different working areas. But so if all these different things, like the collaboration with different NGOs and looking at the EU policy level, what tools that the EU policies offer on the overall or specific level, depending on what you prefer, how successful have these methods been to defend human rights? Because in Hungary, it must be a challenge, especially since that in many cases it's not really, the government is not exactly working for your case in some situations. And as you also mentioned, like there has been various attempts to almost dismantle democracy in the country, and critical voices have been threatened and undermined. So how successful would you say that, or first of all, which methods concretely do you use, and how successful have they been in these different projects?
Yeah, I think obviously there is no place where human rights are protected in a perfect manner, but some places are better than others. And I think this was the dream, that the case of Hungary and now also Poland are or this bubble they are bursting in the European Union. Obviously, the EU for a very long time, the institutions themselves have been extremely slow to recognize and then to react to what was happening in Hungary. And I think this is something we experienced early on. As I said, in 2010, when Viktor Orban again came back to government, and his government rolled out, in rapid succession, a lot of laws that they could do, having gained a supermajority in the Hungarian parliament that allowed them to enact, a new constitution and a lot of new constitutional cardinal laws, as they're called, fundamental pillars of the legal system. We also had to understand what is going on, and we started working on analyzing that and reflecting that to the international and European Union standards that Hungary has assumed, so that are binding, and we had to discover that there is a big gap between the standards and what is happening in Hungary. But this gap had to be explained. This gap had to be something that we would also call attention to. So for quite a long time, it took us, it brought a lot of frustration, in fact, to see how, for example, the European Commission was pretty slow to recognize that there is a huge and a new type of problem created by Hungary. That its initial approach of just looking at single issues, single legal problems that in implementation of EU law or the lack of transposition of EU laws, that looking at these individually in the framework of what are called infringement procedures, where the European Commission launches a legal action or a process that could lead to a legal action at the European Court of Justice, that these will not be enough. If you have a huge problem, as Hungary was, as an avalanche basically, was snowballing into one, then it's not enough to pick out one thread and try to remedy that and then pick out another one. These first initial infringement actions were these piecemeal approaches, and I think what worked was, from our perspective, as an organization, as a human rights organization, is to continue to put out information and to call the attention and explain in a very credible and solid manner what is happening to a larger community. By, I'd say 2014, this became very evident that Hungary is, and what the Hungarian government is doing is not, your run-of-the-mill EU law issues. And that's when many Hungarian civil society organizations also started to be attacked for the advocacy work, the policy advocacy work that they were doing. This, without going into details, meant that many who were receiving funding from what the Norwegian government and has set up as a supplementary fund to many EU member states that need development, both infrastructural and also democracy support. Those NGOs in Hungary who were benefiting from these Norway EEA NGO grants were becoming targets of both first a very high-level coordinated government and media campaign, but then also investigations by the tax authorities. Some also criminal investigations were launched against them. This did not impact or concern directly the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, but we saw that this fell into a sort of a larger puzzle. This was a piece of a tactic that was used in Russia, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, in Egypt, something that we could recognize has a lot of harmful potential. And so in 2014, I think the style of this government also changed quite a lot with this NGO coordinated attacks on Hungarian civil society organizations. There was, of course, a lot of attention to this issue, both in and beyond Hungary, and this put the Hungarian problems with democracy, with the idea that there are checks and balances, and this system also involves civil society's ability to also hold government accountable. This was put on I'd say a global stage. And so from then on, we were thrust as civil society organizations into an arena that most of us, all of us, had not really known before, but all of a sudden we really had to shape up and take and to start swimming rather than sinking. And so then my organization, and this is very visible over time on how our methods changed, we started doing some things more and we started doing other things less. What we started doing more is advocacy on producing information about Hungary, on making sure that we use international and European human rights protection mechanisms as much as possible. There is a lot out there in Europe, but many of it is underutilized by NGOs in a European Union member state. And we started using both the Council of Europe and also the United Nations Human Rights Forum a lot. We gained experience in this too, even more than before. We also started focusing on topics about civic space, civil society, the freedom of association and its practice quite a lot beyond the rule of law questions. And we also started to do a lot more what is called strategic litigation. Now, this is when, if maybe there is not, everybody's a lawyer here, but this is so I would explain, it's when a lawsuit is meant to create change beyond the individual case concerned, to put it simply. So it's either the topic itself or the court that you go to litigate that could bring about this impact. In our case, this meant using the European Court of Human Rights and also trying to get to the European Court of Justice, the EU court in Luxembourg, a lot more. And over time today, in March 2021, we see that this has both worked and both meant a lot of work for my colleagues, particularly the attorneys who are doing this. But we have now succeeded in taking a lot of cases, both on criminal justice, on refugee protection issues, and on also broader rule of law questions to Strasbourg and Luxembourg courts. And so these are two methods basically that we've always used, but we started to do it a lot more. And we had to see that in the Hungarian context, something that many human rights organizations would do, look at draft laws, comment on them, offer suggestions on how a law could be, or a draft bill could be remedied, or how it could be better written to protect human rights. This involves a lot of effort, but it has very little impact in the Hungarian context, because people that you want to send this to, the ministries, government ministries, or members of parliament, or the government itself, will just simply not read it. Those who have the ability to shape laws are not interested in what civil society has to say. This became very obvious. The deadlines for submission of these responses to public consultations became basically illusory, so overnight. Or we heard back informally that whatever comes from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee is not supposed to be read. And so we saw how the sleepless nights that we had been putting into commenting into laws are not bearing any fruit, sadly, not because of the quality. I don't think there was any issue about the quality of the work that we did, but rather because it's not meant to be read. And so this closing of away from critical or constructive remarks is, I think, one of the most typical features of the Hungarian government and its style of government. This persuaded us that we will just focus our energies elsewhere. And we started doing much less about this. One thing that we started doing, which I think many human rights organizations are in the past few years have realized, is to put more effort into better explaining what we do, not to the government, which apparently has no will to listen, but rather to the public. So to focus more on being, on being better communicators in addition to being good lawyers, and that's not that easy to do, particularly when it comes to explaining work that is either seems very boring, abstract, or when it seems that it is hated by a good percent of the population, so that it's not popular. When it comes to refugee protection topics, this is something that, we experience day by day. It's very hard to tell people in Hungary, and also in many, many places in Europe, in many parts of Europe today, that people who flee from war need to be treated as human beings, and that they have rights as human beings, and we must treat them in a rights respective and respectful way. The idea that seems to me very basic and very fundamental in Europe, to even culturally, is coming under so much attack that whoever talks about this in Hungary is going to be attacked herself or himself. And so we have put a lot of effort into learning how to communicate about our work. This meant, doing a lot more public events, focusing a lot on our communications, and also on trying to persuade government, public authorities to be better communicators themselves. So, offering suggestions about how you can explain technical, legal, but important messages to the public in a more accessible way. I think there's more of a tradition of this, or practice of this, for example, in the Netherlands, once I had to look up some Dutch government websites, and I was very intrigued how simple and clear the language can be when it comes to explaining people, how you apply for some sort of tax status, for example. In Hungary, this requires a law degree and literally is a bar for people to exercise their rights as citizens, particularly if you're involved in a criminal process. Then you really need to know what's happening to you, but the language that explains it is very, very difficult to understand. And so we also are running projects, for example, on just plain language communication, not something that is focused on rule of law, but it would be an important thing in any kind of setting. So we have really changed our methods. This is reflected also by the composition of our team. We have a lot of lawyers on staff, but not everybody's a lawyer. And some of the best advocates can be people who have a different background, in social sciences, or even teachers themselves, I think, are really great at knowing how to explain difficult concepts and processes to people who are not familiar with that. So that comes very, very useful in our work.
Yes, thank you for that. You mentioned the importance of communicating with the public. So I was wondering how you do that, because Hungary has become increasingly authoritarian, as you demonstrated. And in the last years, a large number of independent and governmental critic outlets were closed or taken over by government allies, such as also now with the Index, how we saw it in the news that the editor-in-chief was fired after an Orban ally bought control of the site, and then 70 employees or over 70 employees resigned. And so I was wondering, to what extent does this affect your work, or how effective can you communicate the result of your work with the public if you're represented as foreign agents in the Hungarian press? Like, how do you work against that? Or
yeah, this is a crucial question. And of course, in Hungary, we always talk about the lack of media pluralism and how hard it is for journalists to actually operate in a way that is that meets their professional and ethical standards when there's really a lack of resources and a lack of space to do that. But just as an aside, this is not only an issue in Hungary and Poland. When it comes to misinformation and disinformation and the threats that these phenomena have on the quality of our democracy and on our human rights protection space, I think we have to be really cognizant that these threats are everywhere. So it is now, I talked about how the European Commission was very slow to catch on to what was going on. I'm very happy to see that these phenomena about media pluralism, about safety of journalists, about fighting disinformation are now on the European Commission's agenda. I don't know how many of you are following these initiatives, but for example, there's the European Democracy Action Plan that contains specific measures, proposals for measures on these themes. And I think it's important that all of us in Europe are demanding that journalists should be free and safe to do their work. But in Hungary, this takes on a completely different shade, because one of the first things that, and it happens elsewhere too, if you see this as a sort of a playbook, as an autocrat's playbook or an authoritarian evolving scenario, one of the first things that have happened was changes to the media law and a complete takeover of the public broadcaster. We hear a lot about how this has happened also in Poland, both in Hungary and in Poland, the public broadcaster, a source of news that should be impartial and credible and highly professional, they've become basically propaganda outlets. But beyond this, on private media, there are those that have wide outreach to the Hungarian public, both radio stations and also television stations. There are those that are not under the governing parties, Fidesz's influence, I think are having an increasingly hard time. Even one of the biggest nationwide television channels, a privately owned, originally German-owned RTL Club channel, I think has to be in many places extremely aware of the potential threats that it could face if some reporting on political news critical of the government is aired prime time. So one phenomenon that I observe, not being an expert, but certainly somebody who's very concerned about this issue, is that how, basic political news has receded from primetime airwaves. In many countries, you have in Europe, a news program or several news programs competing at 6:30 or 8 p.m., which everybody tunes into. This is where you get your news. You have political talk shows being aired prime time on nationwide channels. This in Hungary has really almost disappeared. It's not only that political news is not interesting to the audience and media outlets respond to this lack of interest, but rather it's become a risky minefield. So maybe by not giving that too much attention, the potential threats can decrease. And this is already something which is usually described as a chilling effect, where a risk that is present but not necessarily affecting you yourself makes you, tailor your behavior to some sort of expectation. And this, I think, is very present in Hungary. But beyond that, of course, we've seen over time how, print newspapers, nationwide newspapers, the number that are able to print government critical or independent news reporting have really dwindled. You can still find a few, but they don't have large circulation. Their advertising revenues, their abilities to actually, reach readers are decreasing basically every single month. And this goes beyond the general ills of the media market that have been brought about by COVID. And most of the independent / government critical media outlets you'd find online. The internet, of course, is in many places much freer than traditional media. But there you'd also have, of course, a lot of issues about who can fund these. And as you talked about this, the number one online news outlet index last summer changed completely because the editor-in-chief was fired basically out of political reasons. And what's, I think, really at the same time, this is a very sad story, but what's really inspiring is that 70 people from the newsroom stood up and said, okay, I'm packing up with him because this is not a place where I will work. And over a span of a couple of weeks, they've managed to set up a new site, which is called Telex. And they have done a huge crowdfunding campaign continuously. And I think most of the revenues are coming from individual donations still. And many other outlets, maybe smaller, also exist from crowdfunding. But even though that is a success, it's not necessarily a fully successful business model in a market that is as small as Hungary, where the size of the market, the language also determines how far you can go with your crowdfunding and your coverage. And so today I have many journalist friends who are extremely proud of the work that they're doing, but are extremely anxious also about the prospects of their outlet being around in a few months' time. And this is very much linked to an environment where advertising spending by even private companies can be really influenced by what the governing party wants to promote, to sustain. Many media outlets, papers, regional papers also are propped up on these basically like ultimately publicly funded, because it's from taxpayer money that is then it evolves into private funds, but but many of these government mouthpieces are funded by originally taxpayer monies without any real readership. So I think the Hungarian public in this is, of course, a very polarized, sadly, both in terms of not only its politics, but also its access to news. You know, if you live in a village in Hungary, your local store just will not carry those papers, those dailies, which are, you know, are not selling. And also you might not be the really, you know, tech savvy, and you might not have a smartphone where you would be scrolling through the various apps that independent online outlets offer. So it's an extremely difficult environment where the prospects, I think, are pretty bleak. But then there are inspiring examples which can show that with a very committed readership, it is possible to support some part of a free press. But the balance, rather the imbalance that persists really impacts on the quality of democracy. For a human rights organization like us, this is a big challenge. How can you even get out to everybody? Even when it is about information on, you know, COVID-related legal issues, when the press would be extremely hesitant, or even you know, refusing to carry any information that has the Hungarian Helsinki Committee's name attached to it. So a lot of people, I think, just can't have access to really important, useful information. I don't want to go into more details on this now, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer. But as a last thought, this is crucial in the times of COVID. So when you need, you know, transparent, reliable, speedy information about what is happening, and a political, basically a gaping gap between the readers and the media outlets is preventing citizens from accessing that, that can create immense difficulties, and it will actually have a very immediate harm.
Thank you so much for giving this good overview of the current situation of Hungarian media. And as you described quite well, the importance of the public broadcasters and the other outlets that have an increasingly hard time. And also quite interesting to hear about that, how the political news have almost disappeared in Hungary, just because it has become such a risky minefield. As you mentioned the COVID crisis, I would like to ask you something about that now as a follow-up, because in March 2020, the government declared a first state of danger. And since then, there was a second, and now we're in the third state of danger that lasts until June 2021. And Hungary is also under the state of medical crisis. So I was wondering, what is the significance of these states of dangers and other legislative acts, and how does Orban use the pandemic to his advantage?
Yeah, many countries, of course, have emergency legislation in some form or other that responds to the pandemic, and some countries don't. and they all have to do something or many things to respond to both the health and the economic crisis that we're living in today. So it's very interesting to see how governments are using these powers, or how they can manage to roll out measures without a need to reach to these emergency measures. Whenever we talk about emergency measures, these should be, you know, really exceptional. They should be exceptional and definite, both in time and in scope. So whenever a government would resort to this, I think all of us really have to be vigilant that this is justified and it's used as only for what it is meant to respond to. Now, in the Hungarian government's case, based on, I think, the past 10 years, there was ample reason to be extremely vigilant and also doubtful whether these wide-ranging powers that the Hungarian government had under the Authorization Act, as it was called, whether they would be actually used in only the justified cases and only, you know, for what they're meant to be. Initially, from last March until June, the Hungarian government really had probably the most broad powers that a European government had to basically set aside legislation and create legislation, government decrees on its own. The Hungarian government was the Hungarian parliament was in session, but the government could go ahead and basically had extremely little limitations on what it could do. And we saw how, beyond measures that were necessitated by the medical crisis, it went to the government exploited this emergency powers, and also the emergency and the anxieties and the sort of all-encompassing nature of COVID and the crisis to abuse these powers and to also amass resources. There was a lot of international attention and criticism about this limitless emergency power. And so in June, this was stopped. And since then, there has been emergency legislation that allows the government a wider scope of action than normally, but there are some limitations that are, I think, reacting to the many-fold criticism that the Hungarian government had received previously. Now, the scope of laws are more restricted, but still, the question is whether everything that is being rolled out is meant to respond to the current health crisis or the ongoing economic crisis, or whether this also is with an eye to basically making things more difficult for opposition political parties, for example, to take part in the political campaign that precedes the next general elections, which will be held in spring 2022, so a year from now. And over time, we've seen how a lot of the measures that have been passed since, basically a year ago, have really had the impact and probably also the intention to limit the room of maneuver for local governments, for the opposition political parties. I would also add that the further narrowing of the media space that I talked about is also part of this. So in this sense, I think it's a very uneven terrain in Hungary for opposition political parties. It's not impossible, but it's very uneven. The playing field is not level at all. It really tilts in the favor of the government. It has already tilted before COVID hit, but this legislation and also the attention that is being diverted from other issues about rule of law, or might I say climate change, while the pandemic is going on, is also serving the government an opportunity to, reshuffle resources, to take away opportunities for the public or for journalists or for others, NGOs, to scrutinize what it is doing. There's been various ways of achieving this, either by adopting rules, for example, that have shrunk local governments' budget revenues. This impacts mostly those local governments which are headed by opposition-led mayors, or by extending, for example, the Freedom of Information Act deadlines for responding to freedom of information requests. So, when you have, as a government agency, 45 days to respond, that response might come, but by the time the journalist receives the answer, it could be completely outdated, irrelevant, and then the press will not be able to exercise its function of keeping government accountable and people informed.
I mean, so this means that, the government has definitely used the pandemic to its advantage and made it even harder for opposition, or by different means, like you described.
Well, all governments, of course, are at an advantage during a crisis, and also a crisis like this. They're the ones who have both the responsibility, but also the ability to act. So as an opposition political party, it's always going to be, ideas and suggestions, but you're not making policy. You are not the ones who will shift resources to hospitals, for example. So the pandemic itself, of course, favors governments, and thankfully, during last spring, the Hungarian population was really spared from the worst of COVID. So all that region in Central Europe, for one reason or another, was not seeing as high numbers as many other places in Europe, like in Italy, for example. That also favored the government's position. Now, though, I think the Hungarian government and many others too are in a much more difficult position. The pandemic has been going on for a year. A lot of people have lost their jobs or seen their income fall. There is a lot of uncertainty, and it's a COVID response. Although there's a lot of effort to portray it as a success story, is not a success story. And it's really awful to see how Hungary is climbing in the ranks of both number of infected people and also number of deaths in this latest third wave of COVID. Could this have been, fully prevented? Certainly not. But could it have been decreased? Did the government do everything it should have done, both in terms of restrictions and also in terms of other measures, mobilizing resources to healthcare, making sure that those get vaccinated first who get into contact with the most people? I mean, these are questions we're all asking everywhere in Europe, but the Hungarian government is very aware that many Hungarians are saying, no, you're not doing things well. And over the past year, there's been plenty of instances which were extremely clear to, I think, everybody who is able to have access to these news, how the Hungarian government has decided to spend enormous amounts of public funding on projects that have like no relevance at a time of the pandemic, infrastructural development, sports stadiums and the like. And at the same time, the hospitals, the whole healthcare system people who are unemployed, businesses that have been impacted or had to close during the restrictions have not been helped out as much as it could have. And at the same time, people also see how things are going, on these specific measures in other EU member states. So it's very easy now to compare where your country stands on unemployment benefits, on furlough schemes, on whatever the sort of numerical indicators too. There are some things that the government might be doing well, but overall it has really failed to help Hungarians who are in need to the extent that it should have done, with its vast amount of powers, with its supermajority in parliament. So I think a lot of Hungarians are outraged, and this is probably also evidenced in polls. In 1 year away from the general elections, I see political analysts saying that many Hungarian opposition parties, which have decided to run in a sort of a united alliance in the next elections, have like a fair chance. I don't want to go into what will happen in a year. I don't think anybody knows, but certainly the Hungarian government does feel the heat, and it does have to know that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with its performance on indicators that all governments are being measured on today in Europe.
Oh, well, thanks a lot for this great explanation. I think, yeah, you're right to say that, of course, in a crisis situation, it's a bit different, and that, yeah, different governments use it to have, yeah, more power than usually. Let me maybe go to a second topic that has been quite prominent in Hungarian media, and that's the topic of refugees. And I mean, Orban has openly undermined EU law by pushing back people at the border and using detention centers. And we have seen images of tear gas, like the Hungarian police using tear gas, barbed wire at the Hungarian border to Serbia. And laws were passed making it illegal for lawyers to, for instance, give protection or like advice to asylum seekers. And I mean, this has been used by Orban to depict that they are a threat to the nation, and also supported by many of his voters. So maybe in this context, how is it for you? Because you've worked on this topic a lot, and the Hungarian Helsinki Committee even risked a lot, because this was illegal according to national law, helping these asylum seekers. And what would you say, what's the difficulty when you have to kind of navigate between national law and EU law, which of course says that this is necessary?
Yeah, asylum and giving free legal advice and representation to asylum seekers is something that the Hungarian Helsinki Committee has basically always done. So as I said at the beginning of this talk, it's something that when I joined literally ages ago, we've always been doing, and have been working with the UN Refugee Agency to provide legal assistance to refugees since 1998. So it's a field where we have built up knowledge, have had tens of thousands of asylum seeking and refugee clients. And so when in early 2015, the Hungarian Prime Minister started talking about migrants arriving to Europe as a source of national security threat, and solely in this context, without mentioning anything else that could have been mentioned about, the needs and the protection needs of people who are fleeing either a terrible situation in Afghanistan, or a constitutional and economic crisis in Kosovo, or a civil war in Syria. Then we didn't even think twice about what we would do, because it was so obvious to us that, we have always worked on asylum. We know this. We know this like it's our second skin. Of course, we're going to speak out in favor of protection, and also of legality and lawfulness. And over time, of course, Hungary has made the news during 2015, I think every single day, with its awful and outrageous and inhuman policies and measures that it has taken. Since 2015 till today, we can say that sadly, the Hungarian asylum system has been completely dismantled. So there's hardly anything left. It's also important to see that the first initial measures in 2015 in the summer, building up a fence at the southern border, trying to keep everybody out, were always had to be supplemented in this anti-migrant policy with further restrictive measures, because they never were as effective in practice as the Hungarian government thought they would be. So, new increasingly restrictive rules about denial of access at the border, about pushbacks at the border, about denial of even food to many of our clients who were detained at the transit zones and had their asylum claims initially rejected. All these were enacted, and still asylum seekers did not disappear. And there's a reason for that, and that is that the Hungarian government, no matter how evil its policies are, cannot stop the wars and the conflicts around the world. It can try to basically ensure that Hungary would be out of any discussion on protection through these practical measures, and also by not willing to take part in discussions at the UN level, or even really undermining the asylum component of the EU's Asylum and Migration Pact. But it cannot stop the conflicts and the drivers of refugee flows. And so over time, this patchwork of measures were done in a way that it was very obvious to us as lawyers, and also I think to the European Commission itself, that this is so much in breach of European Union law that something has to be done. And so now, 5 years later, there's been very many very important cases from the European Court of Justice that have shown that every single piece of this Hungarian asylum labyrinth is against EU law. I'm proud of the work that my colleagues have been doing to show that in a court of law that these policies are unacceptable in Europe, from not only from the perspective of human solidarity, but also from a legal perspective. Of course, the Hungarian government keeps on going because it's politically extremely important for it to keep the migration topic on top of the agenda in Hungary and also in European Union debates. But at the same time, we sadly see that today, the number of asylum seekers in Hungary is probably under 10. Physically, you cannot enter the country as an asylum seeker. The prospect for integration for those who have received protection status is really low, partly because there is no state welfare support to refugees as refugees, partly because of the extremely xenophobic context that the Hungarian government has fueled over these many years with its poster campaigns and its viral messaging. And at the same time, yes, there were measures, both campaigns and newspaper campaigns against individuals and organizations like the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, but also laws enacted to make sure that this narrative would also about enemies and threats would also have faces and names in Hungary who could be pointed to as those that collude with the enemies, those being both the migrants and Brussels. So all through this, of course, we went ahead with our legal and advocacy work, but I must say that it's really difficult to work in an environment where at times, and this is not a daily occurrence, but where at times you would have, propaganda TV channels, TV crews, literally showing up at your office door, asking things that are outrageous, lying about you as the work of your organization. And while we are, of course, a human rights organization and we very much value freedom of speech, we also thought that some of this is beyond freedom of speech. It's just slanderous. And so on occasion, we did have to sue both the Hungarian government and also media outlets and some Fidesz politicians for the slanderous and untrue statements. And so far, we've always won. I think that's also important to see that sometimes we had to resort to these legal methods, but we always said that if we stand up with our legal means for our clients, we might as well also use it to protect our own organization and also other NGOs. We have lawyers on staff, but there's many organizations who don't and who felt really threatened. For example, social workers or small informal groups of volunteers assisting migrants who felt very threatened when this criminal legislation against assisting migrants was adopted in Hungary. People, thought that police would come at 5 a.m. and take them away for helping asylum seekers and refugees out with charitable donations. And so we also had to explain as lawyers to a lot of worried civil society activists that no, you will not be dragged into a jail at 5 a.m. And there will be attorneys to help you should anything happen. I must say, until now, I'm not aware of any criminal procedure that has started on account of this criminal provision, and it is something that will be ruled on by the Court of Justice of the EU probably this year, but it's still on the books, so it could be used. A lot of these measures are probably meant to send out a scary message, a chilling effect, but not necessarily deployed in practice. And the fact that they're not used today does not mean that they cannot be used tomorrow. So I think it's all the more important for these to be declared unlawful and to be undone.
Yeah, thanks. So actually you can say that there's a lot of challenges as working for an NGO working for human rights in Hungary because of these tensions between, well, propaganda TV showing up at your office, but then actually I'm surprised that you say this thing that you actually sue the government or these different medias, and that's where it's actually successful. So that maybe shows the fact that the judiciary somehow is still independent in this regard, but then when it comes to the asylum system, it's a whole other story. But continuing on the whole rule of law crisis, we also had a question from the audience regarding this, so I'm going to incorporate that. So as we've already talked about, in Hungary, there are a lot of, for example, civil society organizations, they face a lot of restrictions, or NGOs like the Helsinki Committee, and journalists and independent media and journalists are smeared by this pro-government media or propaganda media, as it's maybe called. So from an EU perspective, what can the EU do in terms of actions to restore the rule of law in Hungary or help the process? And maybe if you can incorporate this new rule of law mechanism where there's like this conditionality to respect the rule of law, to get EU funds. What do you think that will change anything? And what other legal pathways or political pathways are possible to help Hungary restore the rule of law?
The EU would not be able to do anything, even if it had the best tools, if Hungarians themselves don't demand the full protection of democratic values and civil liberties and human rights. So the way the EU is set up, it can assist, and it should assist these processes. And I think now in 2021, there is a very high awareness of the European Union's responsibility to take action and to strengthen democracy all over the EU. But these measures will never work if there is no local support and demand. And that's why I think the role of local civil society, activists, artists, journalists, doctors, judges, and I can go on, the population in general and in the various constellations that we see it is really important. So I think one aspect that needs a lot of support, and it's not only from the European Union's institutions, the Commission or the European Parliament have a lot of power, but the member states themselves also have a lot of power. Member states, governments, and the people who also influence and hold governments accountable have a lot of power. So I think this is one of the things, the tasks ahead, so to say, is to make sure that individual governments, their national parliaments, and their national constituencies also demand action on democracy protection and conservation, that it's in everybody's interest. In this way, we're really interlinked in Europe. I think that's it's a beautiful thing. It's also a potentially super advantageous thing, and it's also can be extremely harmful too. And we have to be very careful how we use this power. We can help each other out, but we can also see how one country's bad practice, bad policy will eventually end up at our own front door in our living room. It's either through the decision-making mechanisms in the European Council or through adapting or adopting bad practices. And so I think what the European Union can do is, yes, with its latest rule of law efforts, it can monitor. That's this rule of law monitoring report that is now being prepared as the second year. And the second report from the Commission should be coming out sometime in, I think, June, early summer. But beyond monitoring what is happening, it really has to take action when some academics, legal professors who are extremely involved in the rule of law defense say that this actually makes no sense whatsoever. This is just a substitute activity. The house is on fire, and we should not start debating what the color of the paint will be once the new house is being built up, but rather we have to call in the firefighters right now. And so I would echo this by saying it's fine to monitor and to see what's going on in every member state, because it's not only Hungary, it's not only Poland, but it's many, many others. In fact, probably every single one that merits an examination on how it holds up on these democratic core EU value principles. But we really need to call in the firefighters when there's a fire, and there are many fires burning today. And in this respect, legal action is what the Commission should do, and launch infringement procedures rather than hope that some sort of informal or a long dialogue will lead to governments who are really not interested changing their mind. That will not happen. This is naive. And I think the European Commission in many, particularly politically sensitive areas, is hesitant, too hesitant, and sends out signals about not taking fast and effective action. And I don't know if you've had the Polish Ombudsman Adam Bodnar in your debating events yet, but I think it is an extremely important message. What he has sent several times that I've heard him is that while the European institutions are procrastinating or weighing options, people are suffering. And we cannot let that happen. We've talked today a lot about media freedom and journalists and human rights organizations and refugees, but there is a lot more to say about suffering that is happening now also in Hungary to people who love somebody who's of the same sex. How I have heard individuals, Hungarians, say that they feel that they cannot live in Hungary anymore because of the vile narrative campaign that is building up, and also because of the restrictive legal measures that have been enacted just the last year, in a span of a year, that makes it literally very difficult to live as a LGBTI person in Hungary, or a couple even, or even consider having kids. And they feel that they have to literally flee from Hungary, and the same thing happens in Poland. These policies are, maybe they're meant to sustain popular support for an illiberal government, but they're causing immense suffering to individuals. Sometimes the number of these individuals is not very high, or we don't know that it's very high. And so it seems like it's more of a hype and narrative campaign than having real impact. But this is causing suffering, and it's just, I think, outrageous that it's happening in the EU, where even Hungarian nationals feel that they're not safe in Hungary, and don't see a future for themselves because of the restrictions on their human rights. So, to fortify these, the spaces where people can be strengthened and helped, that's, I think, the best the EU can do, but also many other governments. I know that, for example, the Dutch government, let's hope that the new government will continue the practices that the previous one did on the rule of law issues and on many human rights issues, but let's hope that that it will be joined by many others. I think a lot of EU member states would need to come out pretty much in the open and say publicly, and also bilaterally and in closed door discussions too, that certain values in Europe are non-negotiable, and that the policy measures that the EU is taking, both in terms of funding and also legislation, are upholding these. These conversations can be extremely difficult because sometimes they're portrayed as questions about cultural or identity issues, but and there is some space, I guess, for patience on this, and space to develop and progress. But some other questions are really, I would never accept a tolerance for this kind of aggressive rhetoric and policies that we're seeing against our own EU member state nationals or refugees for that matter. And I'd love it if more governments would be very outspoken on this. For that, we need public demand for this outspokenness. So eventually it all comes down to citizens both in Hungary and elsewhere. Yes, there's a question. I see the advice to Hungarians living in other parts of the EU.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, the powerlessness that one feels, particularly at times of COVID, I think is a factor. And also know that there's a lot of people feeling the same way in Hungary. And at the same time, I think it's really important to see the small signs. Just to take these refugee cases that have reached the Court of Justice of the EU, it's important to see that many of them, they were sent there by Hungarian judges who felt that as legal professionals, it is their duty to see when there's a breach of EU law. And it is their opportunity to ask for clarification from the Court of Justice. These judges were very aware of the political context that asylum operates in Hungary. Some of them were actually, subject to slanderous press articles or had disciplinary proceedings against them. And in Poland, it's even much, much worse, obviously, but they still do it. They won't protest on the street. They don't want to see their names become headlines. They're not looking out for this kind of public recognition, but they do what their professional standards in a European Union space dictate. And we see this, I think, on a daily basis in Hungary. A lot of people miss seeing mass protests, particularly because since November, there is a complete ban on public protest in Hungary. No protests whatsoever is allowed. But there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the state of democracy, and people are, I think, very clear. When I walked around in Budapest these past months, I saw a lot of people wearing face masks that are showcasing the symbol of Free SFA, which is the drama drama and cinema academy, which came under basically a complete political takeover. And the students and the faculty, the teachers have done incredibly courageous and also very effective protests. And a lot of people are wearing these masks, expressing their support. When it comes to civil society organizations, we see this every single year when there is a donation, tax donations, or when it came to mobilizing just to help others during the initial wave of COVID last spring, how Hungarians came out really to help through informal or formal organizations. And this is power. So it's not loud, but I think there is a lot of unharnessed power out there. And for you Hungarians outside of Hungary, well, some of you vote. Some of you have difficulties in voting, I know. So I think you can join all sorts of actions around that. But also, one thing is, what really bothers me is that Hungary really has a terrible reputation nowadays. And we individuals who would want to, who out of the most sort of pure national pride would want to restore our country's reputation, also have to speak up to show that there's many Hungarians who don't agree and who want something else, and that something else is a a place where that is progressive, that is forward-looking, where everybody can feel safe, where we can have differences and those can be talked about. So I think we really have to, in this sense, put ourselves out there and to just say it so that it rings loud and clear, because otherwise the plurality of opinions of Hungarians themselves is not showcased enough, and people see that there is not enough drive and energy. I think there is quite a lot, but it just has to be extracted and encouraged. And civil society organizations like the Hungarian Helsinki Committee are certainly behind this and are ready to support people in Hungary mostly who might have any difficulties when it comes to their jobs or anything else when it comes to expression of their political opinion. We've had quite a lot of clients in the past couple of years on this. I think this is the kind of service we can give.
Thank you so much also for mentioning all these important topics that we weren't able to speak about yet, such as the LGBTQI community and the restrictions that they're facing and the protest of the FZFE university, sorry. So I was wondering if, does this give hope for the future, for the next elections? If you see so many protests like as the university one, but also for the index or against the slave law that were all in the last mandate of Orban. So do you think we should be hopeful for next year?
Well, what I would be hopeful for is not necessarily in terms of the exact outcome of the election in terms of who gets how many votes and posts and seats, but rather whether the election results leaves a government that is that has stronger checks on it. So I think that is the most important thing, and that would be true in any scenario, is that unchecked power leads to the erosion of democracy. And we can see that, from the US throughout Europe and in many other parts of the world, obviously. What the Hungarian case study shows us is that there's nothing that can be taken for granted in this. And I think the best solution, the best outcome would be a better balanced power structure in Hungary. That would not be, obviously the election day and the election results are extremely important for that, but there is a lot more when it comes to institutions, when it comes to the press, when it comes to academic freedom. There is a lot more to do. But certainly that can be a pivotal moment. We see how it works out, and there is a long way to go. I think attention to having free and fair elections is really important. And on this, we don't have a very clear picture on Hungary, particularly when it comes to the fairness of the campaign, the equal access issues about resources, about media. Those are very much in doubt.
Thank you so much. And before we conclude, we have one last question. What would be your advice for students in our audience who want to become involved in working for improving human rights?
There is a lot to do, and there is thankfully, I think, a lot of opportunities for this. I think this kind of events are great because, I mean, that's like something that you can do now on Zoom. but also one part is learning, the other part's doing. And I think there is quite a lot to do, even within one's own vicinity. So I don't know if any of you are lawyers, if you have clinical programs in your law school or any kind of hands-on, practical opportunity that can help you professionally develop and also help people who need support. That I think is a really good experience. The other thing as students that you can do is, as always, organize and mobilize. I think this is why, for example, this protest around the Hungarian theater school was so important, because it was probably better done than most of the sort of traditional protests. And I think this kind of the testing, the willingness to take risks, the creativity is something that people at universities and at this age have more of. And maybe less risk averse, less focus on perfection, maybe. I think that's a great advantage. If we only had that throughout our lives, that would be great. But also one thing, which is not in terms of like method, but in terms of topic, is to, and it's probably not the right audience to say this, but to start focusing on politics too. There is so much out there to divert and entertain, but the thing that really determines how we live our life is politics. And so I would encourage reading and following the news from an early age, and making sure that it's quality, and also not only one thread, one channel, one voice, but to make sure. I don't think students are very loaded when it comes to money, so supporting, independent news outlets or that kind of thing is maybe not something that you can do now, but you can help them exist by promoting them, and then when you have the means to support them with finances. But there's a lot of independent small outlets out there that need preservation, and also national newspapers are just as much under threat, particularly in this last year. I think that's a very important thing. Yeah, read, buy newspapers, subscribe.
That's some really nice advice, and I think that definitely something that we think we are the right audience for that. I mean, we can never be said enough times that getting involved and reading the news and following it is super important. But thank you so much for all these. I mean, for this discussion, it was so interesting for all of us, and I'd like to maybe highlight a few points that at least I thought was very interesting. So what you mentioned in the beginning about the position of and the importance of law as a discipline, both in theoretically but also in practice, that knowing your rights or knowing the law, it puts you in a powerful position. For example, what you mentioned with the whole asylum and detention centers, and on the other hand, not knowing your rights is also a great disadvantage and makes you very vulnerable. So that's why organizations like yours are so important. And then when we talked about the rule of law, it was also, I didn't know that there was this collaboration going on between the different NGOs trying to kind of work together across borders. So that was also interesting to learn about. And the whole history of how the Helsinki Committee has evolved from working on certain issues to now working on more advocacy and producing information and this whole strategic litigation, which is also something that you have started doing in the recent years. Yeah, and then also our discussion on media in Hungary and media pluralism. That's such an important issue, and how it's, and a point that surprised me that I didn't think about was the fact that you said talking about politics in the news in Hungary is becoming this risky minefield, as you said, that it's almost more risky to start mentioning what's happening in politics, and it puts you in a risky position. And that, at least that's not a situation that I could have recognized from where I am sitting in Copenhagen for my sake. But that was interesting to hear. But well, there were so many interesting points, just to highlight a few. But thank you so much for coming. Fanny, I think you can maybe conclude with thanking Marta, because thank you so much for coming. It was really an interesting discussion, and we learned so much.
Yes, thanks again also from EDI, and thank you to the audience for all joining and asking questions. I think, as Marta highlighted at the end as well, there are so many problems, but it's always good to start and get practical experience and learn from people who are actually in the field. So it was great for us to get a little insight into how this actually works in Hungary, the challenges you face, and maybe also hopeful things that we can maybe look forward to. So yeah, I thank you so much for taking your time and joining us, and I wish you good luck also for the future in Hungary. And thank you to the audience for joining. It was great.
Yeah, thank you all for coming and for the invitation. It was really nice to take part in this discussion. There's a lot of topics that we dipped into but didn't cover in depth. But if you're interested in getting more information, please reach out, and I can maybe put you in touch with those who know more about this, or refer you to materials. I'm happy to do that. And yeah, all the best to you too. Stay strong in this pandemic, and it's great that you and we could all be together in this virtual space. All the best to everybody.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, if you want to reach out, you can also write to us, and then we can forward it to Marta.
Sure.
And yes, maybe it's easier. And you can follow us on Facebook also for future events. And yeah, we will put on our YouTube channel and on Facebook, we will put the event online. So in case your friends missed it or you still want to go back to it, it will be available. And we have an event in April coming up with Kai Sauer, who is Undersecretary of State of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. So we'll move up north and discuss a little different, also to politics, but a different topic regarding his experience in the UN as a representative of Finland, also Finnish politics, and also his role in the Balkans, because he was there during the Balkan Wars and after. So yeah, we hope to see you soon again. Follow us and stay in touch, and we hope you enjoyed this event.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Francesca.